Souls games have always been something special. Each and every one provides an amazing and unique experience you can't find anywhere else in gaming. From Software is the company that started it all with Demon Souls. Ever since that title, the term Souls games, later Soulsborne games, were all seen as a niche genre of gaming that provides a player with a challenging and beautiful world laced together by a cryptic story and difficult boss fights. As time passed and more titles released, especially Elden Ring, the fanbase of Soulsborne games grew. With that, many companies tried to capture the experience that From Software provides within their own titles, creating the term Soulslikes. This was an entirely new genre that literally means like a Souls game. Though, no matter how many qualities a game shared with From Software's titles, it could never be called a Souls game as it was not produced by From Software themselves. Additionally, they all had their own quirks and were most definitely not as polished as the Souls titles, giving them a reputation as something to play if you've already finished all the main Souls games and are looking for something new. They are always seen as second pick because of their apparent weaknesses, so I for one never batted an eye at this terminology. Today, however, I want to talk about a game that was released about a year ago, a Souls-like that in my opinion has evolved from that subgenre and provides an experience on par with From Software's own creations that even exceeds some in certain aspects. A game that rises above its competition and has laid the quality standard for any Souls-likes in the future. That game is Lies of P. Already, from just the title, this game has an eye-catching concept, a Soul-style game about Pinocchio the puppet. While it's its own game with its own unique aspects, it can't help being compared to the main Souls titles as that's the inspiration it used. So before I talk about how it is unique, let's talk about its similarities. First off, it is a very linear title, similar to Dark Souls 3. Some people like this, some don't. I think this structure is perfect for this title as it has a much clearer story that is helped a lot by this linear structure. It still has a Soul-style level design complete with bonfires, shortcuts, and hidden enemies. Honestly, I like this structure a lot, as it makes the game a straightforward option if you're looking to use all of your brain cells on the boss fights rather than figuring out where you need to go next. It is good to have this choice as, like I said, besides Dark Souls 3 and maybe Sekiro, the other titles don't really offer this brainless navigating experience. Next we got the parry mechanic, comparable most to that of Sekiro. Block and you take reduced damage. Block at the perfect time and you get a perfect parry, dealing stance damage and protecting yourself completely. It is a very fast parry animation that every weapon can do, and the game pretty much expects you to learn it as a core combat option as most fights will be extra rough if you don't use it. It is also worth mentioning that this parry is much harder to execute than Sekiro's. The timing is very unforgiving, and when the game tells you to press guard at the exact time you get hit, it means it. If you mess up slightly, you will get hit with the full force of the attack, making blocking often a safer and less risky option. Speaking of blocking, our next similarity is the rally mechanic in Bloodborne. For those of you that are unfamiliar, in Bloodborne when you get hit, you have a short window to attack the enemy back to regain some or all of that missing health before it goes away permanently. This heavily encourages an aggressive playstyle. In Lies of P, the same mechanic is in effect. However, you can only regain the health that you lost from blocking an attack. When you block an attack, you take reduced damage and lose some stamina. It is a less risky option than parrying, but also has a much smaller reward. The nice thing about it is if you go for a parry and miss, about half the time it will result in being a block, so at least you take less damage with the option of regaining the health anyways. The last big similarity is your Legion arm. This is extremely comparable to the prosthetic arm in Sekiro, offering a wide range of uses that can help you offensively or defensively, ultimately just adding another option to the arsenal available to you. That is it for the obvious game-specific similarities, but as you will see throughout this video, the overall core gameplay of Souls titles is definitely integrated into this game in almost every way. You have your bonfires, lose your currency on death, vague quest lines, dodge rolls, and ruthless bosses. That is just the tip of the iceberg, and I'm sure those of you who have played it can attest to how close they got to From Software's quality. Now, with the comparisons out of the way, let's go over every aspect of this game and what makes it an outstanding title worthy of standing on the same level as From Software's greats. The story in Lies of P is one of its most interesting qualities. You play as P, which implies the name Pinocchio, in the city of Krat. You discover this city has fallen victim to the puppet frenzy, and this led to the massacre of the city's population. As you play through the game, you will encounter your father, Geppetto, as well as other familiar faces of the Pinocchio tale in the form of allies or even enemies. If you are aware of the story of Pinocchio, then you'll get a kick out of the familiar names, but if you aren't, it really doesn't matter and doesn't affect the story itself in any way. This game has the theme of Pinocchio, but is obviously set in a much darker and more horrifying setting, almost like it was touched by From Software. The story crafted for this game was honestly one of the better ones I've seen, being an emotional tale of a puppet that has 3 different endings depending on decisions you make throughout the story. There's one somewhat issue I had, being the sharp turn from the Puppet Massacre storyline to the Simon Manus one. About halfway through the game, all of the enemies you fight up to this point have been puppets, but suddenly switch into being these deformed carcasses, and a whole new villain arises. I found both parts of this story good, it was just a little odd how much of a shift there was halfway through. The story is also massively benefited through the full voice acting by all of the characters, making sure each and every one feels alive. You have the option of doing side quests with some, resulting in you discovering more of the characters' own stories and personalities, again making the world seem more alive. You are a puppet, but have the ability to lie, to learn, and to become truly alive if you make the right choices, those only a human would make. These choices show up throughout quest lines and the rest of the game, all leading to what ending you will get. In my eyes, this story is not perfect, but its addition certainly improved the game and does a great job at making the setting and plot twists feel original and once again separating it from the games that it was inspired by. Like I mentioned earlier, the level designs are definitely very linear. This brings pros and cons, but overall I enjoyed this style, as once I was done with an area, I wouldn't feel like I left a lot of content untouched, but rather I'd be ready to tackle the next level. Speaking of levels, they are crafted perfectly for what it intends to do. Taking place mostly in the city of Krat, each level is still different from one another and has its own aesthetics, enemies, and hidden rewards. It also follows the less checkpoints, more shortcuts feature, with plenty of shortcuts making you realize the level is a lot more connected than you thought. Upgrade materials, consumables, and weapons can all be found throughout these areas, making it worthwhile to check out every alleyway and ladder you may pass by, and certainly rewarding you for your efforts. Also, let's not skip past how beautiful the visuals are in this game. The detailed design and atmosphere of each and every location is stunning and made me genuinely stop and admire the scenery every time I pick up the game. The structure of these levels is also a factor in the replayability of this title, as it's a lot less daunting than replaying an open world game and running all over the place to proceed. Instead, you just need to keep going forward. A relaxing change to the formula that is definitely seen as a plus whenever I get burnt out of the more open world titles. So overall, it's a world design that perfectly complements the story and gameplay that gets no complaints from me. Alright, on to the more fun stuff in this game, starting with the weapons. The obvious standout aspect in this game is the ability to mix and match handles and blades. There are a ton of each to choose from, offering a wide variety of damage types, attack speeds, and ranges. Additionally, each handle and blade has its own unique skill that when you mix and match them give you some really cool combinations. If there's not a weapon that feels right for you, then just make it. Also, there are weapons that you can only get from bosses. These are not able to be broken up into blade and handles, but are standalone weapons that each have their own skills and playstyles attached. These two options covered everything I could have wanted in terms of an arsenal at my disposal. My personal favorite weapons are the Twin Dragon Sword that is a boss weapon, and any blade attached to the Booster Glaive handle, as it gives you this very useful rushing attack. Again, so many options to choose and create, but all are balanced well, so nothing you choose will be too weak or too strong. The addition of crank items has to be one of my favorite quality of life decisions in any Souls or Souls-like game. These items change the scaling of any weapon you want in order to better fit your stats. So instead of having to deal with an unoptimized build just because you want to try something new, you just alter the scalings in your favor. Now, if you were to use a technique crank, which is like dexterity, on an already technique scaling weapon, this is going to result in the best possible scaling, but having the option to make it scale with other attributes is still a good addition to have, making the very solid weapon selection even more accessible. Another somewhat weapon at your disposal is your Legion Arm. These have a wide variety of uses and can be each individually upgraded to get more uses and overall just stronger. Some options will be better in some areas or against some enemies, but you honestly can't go wrong with any of them, as they are never a critical part of combat that you will rely on, rather just another option to spice up the fights or sometimes give you the upper hand. Now that we've talked about the weapons, let's move on to the core combat mechanics and fights in this game. First, this game plays fast. The bosses are definitely quicker than the early Dark Souls iterations and more comparable to Bloodborne, Sekiro, and Elden Ring in terms of speed. A lot of attacks that are thrown out are too quick to be avoided with a roll or quickstep, and this is where the blocking and parrying mechanic comes into play. This game really wants you to block and parry using the normal dodging sparingly and only for certain situations. They even added a type of attack that glows red that you cannot dodge or block but only parry, or you can just hope you're not close to it to begin with. This makes the combat definitely have a learning curve, as if you're coming from Elden Ring, then you will most likely have to learn the blocking, rally, and parrying systems, and even if you have experience with games like Sekiro, the parry window is much smaller, so it will still take some time to get used to. However, when you have overcome that learning curve, it is an amazing combat system that deserves all the praise it receives. It feels structurally solid, unlike most Soulslikes that try to replicate From Software's quality. If I need to nitpick it, I will say that the stamina recovery speed in this game feels slower than the other titles, and so I almost always have to have the recovery speed buff on in order to not have to take long pauses in the fight just standing there recovering. Not a big deal, but worth noting, as it was something I noticed at the start of the game when you have very low stamina. Seeing as that's my only nitpick, I think it's safe to say that this game's combat is an impressive feat for sure. Bosses are the bread and butter of any game that wishes to be in the Souls genre. They are what provide the greatest challenges, the cinematic end to an area, and often are the most memorable experiences from the game. So, how did Lies of P do in creating these experiences? Well, as you probably expected, that is yet another win, as the developers have crafted quite an impressive roster of boss battles that all differ from each other without being dishonest to the core combat system laid out. There's also a decent range of difficulty, but no fights are gimmick ones, so no matter what, you feel good when you win. Sometimes you will get it on your first try, others on your fifth, and some will take you a long while, so if you're itching to have your character downright disrespected, then again, Lies of P has it covered. Looking at the roster as a whole, I think this is one of the strongest lineups that any game has, as each and every fight offers at least a good experience, if not great or an amazing one. There isn't a weak link in sight to drag this selection down. When thinking of a Souls game, the soundtrack is not normally one of the factors that comes to mind, but that does not change how important it can be in setting the vibe for all of the different emotions and experiences these types of games provide throughout their story and fights. Let's just say the developers once again knocked this category out of the park, making an amazing soundtrack that is full of songs that cover a wide range of applications, from making the storytelling moments hit harder or the boss fights more grand, all while falling under a similar theme fitting of the time period this title is set in. The developers themselves knew how good they made the soundtrack, as they even made the songs collectible records that are not only an achievement, but help you reach one of the endings by listening to them. They're pretty much just showing off at this point. That about wraps up all the major categories of this title, but I can assure you this is still just the surface of what this game has to offer, and I'm still amazed at the quality and effort put into this title that leads it to being way more than just a Souls-like. The studio behind the development of this title also announced that DLC will be coming with no confirmed date as of now, but I'm sure it will impress us just as much as the base game did. If these developers continue to put out games of this quality and even better, then From Software won't just have another studio trying to replicate its magic, but rather some competition to watch out for. That brings us to the end of the video. I had a good time replaying this game for footage, and it got me more and more excited to talk about it. I hope this video either reminded you how great this game is or convinced you to play it for yourself. Regardless, let me know in the comments what your thoughts are. With that, like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and until next time.